Thanks for everyone for coming, and thanks to the speakers for their papers yet to come. So this presentation is going to introduce a new research project which is broadly concerned with the lives and work of female dealers in mid-century Britain and the impact of their legacy in modern British public art collections. And I'm also going to talk a bit about how this research features as part of a new exhibition at the Hepworth Wakefield that's opening this November, to show or sort of give an example of how kind of embedded some of these histories are in public collections. And yet, how much I think these women's roles have been generally overlooked. So because this research is in fairly early stages, it would be really brilliant if any of the dealers' names who I'm going to mention do feature in your own resource, in your own research, or indeed in your own public collections. It would be really great to connect over email, and I'm hoping maybe Sophie will circulate a list of the names that I'm going to mention. So if you do want to sort of delve into this in your own collections, you'll be able to do that. Okay, so to kick off, pictured here is Helen Lesor at the Beaux-Arts Gallery in London in the early 1960s. Lesor began working at the gallery in 1931 before she took over as director in 1951, remaining in post for a further 15 years. As director, she was responsible for orchestrating the short-lived trajectory to fame of the kitchen sink painters pictured here on the right, who became the poster boys for realism in mid-century British painting. Yet Lesor is basically a footnote in the far more prominent histories of these painters. Not only did Lesor very successfully group and promote the work of the kitchen sink artists, so they didn't actually group themselves and name themselves that way. Lesor was really responsible for doing that. But hers was one of the first galleries to give solo shows to Francis Bacon, Frank Auerbach, and Leon Kossoff in the early and mid-1950s. So here we see Lesor sitting on her own bed in the Beaux-Arts Gallery, where she not only exhibited the art that she was dealing, she actually made her own art there. She was also a painter, and she also lived there. And I really love this image by Lord Snowdon, because I think he's really intentionally kind of composing this portrait in this kind of somber way, but it sort of really embodies this reality of Lesor living and working in this small space, which I feel like is something we can all like really relate to right now. Okay, so Lesor is really typical of a number of women who in the 1930s took up careers in commercial art galleries, often first as secretaries like Lesor, working their way up to directorial positions in a relatively short space of time. And I'll go into who these people are in a minute. This is just to give you a kind of overview of the number here. But so for me, this is really interesting that we don't really tend to see a great deal of prominent women working in the arts at this time. So the fact that the commercial art world sort of offers a space for women to work, or maybe I should say these entrepreneurial women created spaces for themselves to work, opens up, I think, a really interesting kind of scope to explore a wider context of art history. So one that goes beyond simply focusing on art and artists, but to really sort of see how the role of these women, who I would argue played a really key role in galvanizing certain subcultures of modern British art. So I'm going to whiz through quite quickly and just sort of introduce you to some of the people who I think are really important. And again, this is just to kind of get their names out there to you, so I'm not going to pause a great deal. So these are artists from the 30s and 40s. Have sort of indicated some of the kind of more well-known names of artists associated with them at the bottom there. So we have Peter Norton in the London Gallery in the late 1930s there. We have Lucy Wertheim, who had galleries in London and in Manchester in the 1930s. And Lucy Wertheim worked quite closely with Alice Storey. Alice Storey worked for Wertheim for a while. She also opened her own gallery, the Storen Gallery. She was director at Redfern and was associated with Stafford Galleries. Peggy Guggenheim and her sister Hazel King Farlow. I'm going to talk a little bit more at the end of my talk about how they impacted on Wakefield's collection, so I'll park that for a minute. Leo Bondi Jarre ran St. George's Gallery in the 40s and was sort of particularly interesting for focusing on expressionist work. She's also Tess Jarre's aunt. And Anna Bilbo and Jack Bilbo were partners who ran the Modern Art Gallery together from the 1940s into the 1960s. Then we move, obviously not a great deal happens in the 40s, although there's some things happening there, but into the 50s and 60s. So we see Erica Browson, who was really integral in supporting Francis Bacon's career, working out of the Hanover Gallery. Lillian Browse supported a number of British artists, particularly throughout the 30 years and post-war period. Annalee Yuda and Halima Nalech were really important art, dealers for celebrating work by artists from Europe, particularly Nalech was promoting Polish artists. Alana Coleman was promoting Australian artists. She was Australian herself, and she brought artists like Sydney Nolan over to the UK, and Madeleine Vespera of the New Art Centre, which is now the New Art Centre at Roche Court, was collecting a number of sculptures. So that's a very quick whiz through of some of the people who I've become interested in. And I should certainly say there are a lot of scholars who are working on these individuals already. This isn't like I'm sort of recuperating them. There's some amazing work happening already, which I'd be happy to share more sort of bibliographic information if you're interested. But as far as my research goes, I've been sort of trying to track these dealers, their artists and their gifts particularly into public collections. And what's become increasingly clear and quite interesting to me is that many of these dealers were really taking risks on launching the careers of unknown emerging artists, many of whom were emigre refugees. So these dealers worked really hard to exhibit these works, and it's quite interesting the way it happened in regional galleries. And I don't have a ton of time. I mean, it's a huge story, and I think every regional collection will have its own history of this here, but they really did work in regional galleries and with curators. And that's sort of something that I'm kind of in the process of unpicking right now. But from what I've discovered, there are at least 200 works to date that have been gifted into public collections by dealers. And I expect there will be many, many more as I kind of work my way through. I think that's actually most of that data is coming from Art UK. So it will be mostly paintings. Okay, so one commonality between these women that really piqued my interest was that many were emigres themselves. So I've highlighted there in green frames those dealers who were emigres. And I think there's a lot to be said for the fact that they were supporting emigre artists particularly. I mean, it's very well documented that the British art world in the 30s and 40s, it was this exposure to sort of non-British artists and styles that really catalyzed different forms of modernism, from abstraction, surrealism, expressionism, and realism, and so on. And of course, not just in art, but in all kinds of new ways of living. So I think that's something I really want to think about a bit more, is how these sort of support networks were fostered there between immigrants. And then also I've highlighted here another commonality that I think is really important, is that many of these dealers were Jewish, and having left Europe fleeing Nazi persecution, they settled in Britain. Some of them only for a few years, some of them stayed in Britain permanently. But I think it's the fact that it wasn't just their career opportunities, these kind of ways that they were able to make money and sort of support themselves, but it's these sort of immigrant refugee networks of mutual support that I'm quite interested in, what it might have meant for young immigrant artists to have, someone already in place, kind of network in place for them to make work. So one of my working hypotheses, which I am kind of interested in testing out the more I can research and when I can get down to actually use archives, is that by these dealers acting as sponsors, as bridges to European artists or to galleries in Europe, and as support systems to emigrate artists and also young British artists, there's this sort of professional and emotional network that's also materializing that I think was really creating conditions necessary for certain kinds of avant-garde art, but also life. So many, not many, but some of these dealers were lesbians. And I think it's important to kind of, remember that maybe these smaller private art worlds created space for people to not just kind of live the lives they wanted to live, but also, you know, foster creative networks for artists to also make the kind of art they wanted to make. And so the fact that these artworks and these networks create ways and systems for modern art to come into public collections especially regional collections, is what I'm trying to think about. So I'm sort of, you know, playing around with how to structure this, but I think what I want to do is kind of explore a slightly different model of art history here. So maybe not focusing on primarily artists and artworks, but actually on thinking about the conditions for art making. And this is something I think for many years now I've been interested in, is sort of labor and the idea about, you know, how do we sort of integrate how artists were able to make art, not just sort of fetishizing what they actually made, the product, but really thinking about the kind of conditions necessary to make art. And I think that these dealers really play into that. And I think this kind of requires interrogating some assumptions that I feel like I'm reading about a lot, about the interactions between private and public art worlds. And I think I really want to unpick this a lot more going forward, and thinking about maybe the work of these dealers wasn't simply financial. It wasn't about them sort of gaining status or you know, kind of having a career in London that would somehow you know, give them exactly the life they want. It was also, I think it's important that we're sort of thinking a bit hand in hand about how public collections and private collections have a deeper relationship than that. And I think that also requires interrogating public collections as being financially motivated. Sometimes we think about dealers as being financially motivated, but I think public collections also need to be interrogated that way. And also thinking about dealers as also being philanthropic. And I guess this project, I want to think about where that sort of muddies the waters. So I want to talk specifically about the Hepworth Wakefield and some of the research that I've been doing, and that's going to be going into this collection display that will be opening very soon. So this November, the Hepworth Wakefield will be hosting a gallery-wide exhibition. So this is a really, really ambitious display of the collection, and we're going to be sort of talking about the way it developed, and particularly focusing on some of the lesser known stories in our collection's histories. Maybe, I mean, certainly be showing our key artworks, but also kind of really looking at some of those maybe smaller stories that shape the collection in important ways. And one of those is thinking about the curators, directors, and the donors, particularly who sort of impacted on the collection in the early half of the 20th century, and that's what I want to focus on a bit more now. So one of the sections that I'm working on at the moment is going to focus on the impact of Peggy and Hazel Guggenheim, so sisters who I've already mentioned briefly in this presentation, who really enhanced Wakefield's collection in the 1930s. And I want to acknowledge that this isn't just my work. This is a research project that was started by Hilary Flo, who's a former curator at the Hepworth Wakefield. If we're talking about networks of women, I absolutely want to acknowledge that Hilary started working on Hazel before I joined the gallery, and I'm really pleased to pick up her work. So to just tell you a bit more briefly about Wakefield Art Collection. So on the left, you can see the original Wakefield Art Gallery, where the gallery began in 1923. It actually opened as a public gallery in 1934. That's the original site. Obviously, the Hepworth Wakefield is now at a different site where we host the collection. But the first director was the young Ernest Musgrave, who you can see here, who from the outset adopted what I think is quite an extraordinary and ambitious policy, particularly around collection, which aimed to nurture an understanding of contemporary art in Yorkshire, which is a pretty progressive approach for a regional gallery at the time. And it was with this vision in mind that Musgrave gave particular support to emerging local artists such as Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore. So you can see Musgrave here with Henry Moore's reclining figure from 1936. And actually, Hazel King Farlow donated a small sum of money towards the purchase of this work into the collection. So this sort of begins to give us a sense about Hazel's role in the gallery. So Hazel King Farlow, previously Guggenheim, was the younger sister of Peggy Guggenheim, and Hazel moved to the UK in 1931 due to her marriage to Dennis King Farlow, which I think was her third or fourth marriage by this point. And interesting as a sidebar, Hazel was quite difficult to track through public collections because she did have, she was donating art under, I think, 3 or 4 different names, depending on who she was married to at the time. So she's a sort of creates a bit of a puzzle. But anyway, so Hazel moves to the UK in 1931. Peggy doesn't move to the UK until 1937. She joins her sister from Paris because of the impending wave of fascism spreading across France. Now, the sisters were wealthy anyway. We know this from the Guggenheim family, but they actually came into their money in 1937. Their father died on the Titanic much earlier, but when their mother died in, I think it was 1936, 1937, that's when they inherited just a huge amount of money. And this really was kind of the impetus for them to begin buying art and collecting. So when they both arrive in Britain, they begin to be introduced to artists, curators, collectors, and dealers across the UK, and enthusiastically buying artwork. And Hazel also starts to paint herself. So for me, what's interesting during this time, sort of trying to think about these financial models a bit, is that Peggy keeps buying and buying and exhibiting modern art, but she doesn't actually sell very much of it. And Hazel starts buying work, but then she starts giving it away. So this is the kind of model we're looking at. So Hazel visits Wakefield in 1937. And between that visit in 1937 and in 1939, she gifts 26 works into Wakefield's collection, including one of her own paintings, which you can see in the top left-hand corner there, Swiss Lake. And you can sort of see there's quite a kind of visual and kind of stylistic similarity across a number of those gifts. But Hazel would continue to gift work into the collection over the following decades, and they were gifted under her own name. So you can see an Eve Tongi work there, and also Hepworth work that comes in later in 1956, among a number of other works. But 2 works also come into the Wakefield collection at this time, but they are donated under Peggy Guggenheim's name in 1937. And these are 2 paintings by Geer van Velde, who Peggy had bought these works from the artist earlier that year, and then they were later borrowed back from Wakefield to put on display at Peggy's own gallery, which she had opened in London, called Guggenheim Jeune in 1938. The donations established a solid relationship between the Guggenheim sisters and Wakefield Art Gallery. Following a trip to Wakefield in 1937, Hazel writes what I found this letter in the archives this week. She writes this quite funny letter to flatter Musgrave, and she rather effusively notes that he has, quote, awakened Wakefield's aesthetic sense, end quote. And she describes him as, quote, the most enlightened curator in existence, end quote. So Hazel's sort of courting this relationship with Musgrave, and Musgrave certainly was courting the relationship with Hazel because, not least, she was bringing a lot of work into the gallery. And actually, he gave her an exhibition of her own work in 1956. Hazel continued to facilitate a number of interesting works. So here's a letter talking about the facilitation of a Henry Moore watercolor. And then Hazel also facilitates this interesting work by Eve Tongi, who, I mean, it's unusual that this work came in with Hazel's name because actually Peggy facilitated most of the nature of the admin of this gift, and Peggy was in quite a close relationship with Eve Tongi at the time. You can see in this photo of them in Sussex on holiday together in 1938. So I suppose what I'm really interested in here is the way these gifts are sort of coming into this collection at the time through the kind of activities. Peggy Guggenheim is exhibiting a lot of international European artists in London in her gallery. And I think my working assumption right now is that there's this sort of very fast dispersal of works in 38 and 39, because by 1939, Peggy and Hazel are needing to leave the UK and go to New York because of the war. So I think a lot of these works end up going into public collections, probably because they couldn't take them with her. Now, Peggy took a lot of her works with her, but she did leave 2 works in public collection. And as far as I can see on Art UK, the only works in public collections that Peggy Guggenheim donated that are oil paintings are, in fact, these 2 Van Velde works. So I'm sure there are more, but I haven't found them yet. Anyway, so Hazel gives works as she departs. She gives works to Wakefield, to Manchester, Southampton, Scotland, Bristol, and she gives a very extraordinary Kandinsky to Tate. It's a shame she didn't give that to Wakefield, but never mind. So really, you know, I've been starting to track where these works are going. Lucy Wertheim gave an extraordinary number of works out. I think there's 150 works by Lucy Wertheim in UK public collections, and Towner Art Gallery are going to be having a massive exhibition of Wertheim's gifts, I think next year or the year after. So I think that'll be great. So I'm just going to wrap up with some concluding notes here. So some conclusions, and to bring this kind of into a present moment. I think for many of us working in museums right now, of course, this is a deeply troubling time. And a lot of us are returning to our collections to think about how we can move forward with assets that we can really use, because of course in the sort of time of austerity that we are in and will be in for a while, we just aren't going to be able to have expensive loan-based exhibitions. But I want to sort of turn this problem on its head and propose that this might in fact be a really extraordinary time to think about our collections and actually do some much needed decolonization work. And I'm sorry I don't have more time to talk about this, but I think with the renewed focus on collections, I want to pose that this is the time we really need to be identifying and interrogating the way our public collections have been built and structured by dominant forms of power. For a long time, I think public museums, especially regional museums, have relied upon excuses, kind of excusing the kind of chaotic and incoherent way their collections came to exist under various directorial strategies over the last century. And yes, as staff, we've inherited these problems, but I think we need to be much more open and honest about how power dynamics, especially sexism, racism, and other exclusionary mechanisms, have left our collections with major gaps. I think we need to see this as an opportunity in our programming and not as a weakness. And although there is amazing work being done across the museum sector about sort of I suppose addressing these gaps with acquisitions, this is largely happening through contemporary acquisitions of art. And I just don't think it's enough to kind of plug a hole. I think we really need to address how those gaps came to be in the first place and really use what we have in our collections to draw out those deficits. So looking at the work of female dealers in our collection and donors and relationships with commercial galleries, I think offers one way to start to expand a field of inquiry across territories of economics and personal, sexual, professional relationships when we're really interrogating the history of public collections. And while I'm taking female dealers as one way to foreground the stories of women, we have to acknowledge that most of them are white and middle class. It's imperative that we're also considering the parallel social histories of our collections and how they were built through those moments, and ask if we can represent those stories even when we don't have objects in our collection that directly refer to them. And that's everything from me. Thanks.